Section 4 is Propaganda Fides in History. The moderator for this section is Professor Patrick Devane. Father Patrick is a Belgium CICM priest. He is a sinologist and a member of the executive committee of our center. He teaches and has published history on Catholic education in China, Mongolian Chinese encounters, and mission history. Father Patrick.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lucia, for your nice introduction. I'm very happy here to conclude this first day of the conference. We really had some exciting and very interesting speeches and topics. But in this session, I feel very privileged and also honored to introduce two excellent researchers with many years of experience. And the first one will be Professor Claudia von COLLANI. She's professor of Sociology and Dialogue of Religions at the University of Würzburg in Germany. She specializes in East Asian mission history and theology of early modern times, including the Chinese rights controversy, enculturation, cultural and scientific exchange between Europe and East Asia. She has been involved in several international research projects, for example, the Acta Pekinensia project at the Ricci Institute in Macau, and several other projects. She also was, I know her from our regular conferences or gatherings of the Philanthropist Institute in Louvain, where she was a very loyal participant. So I'm happy to see her again today. And then our next speaker will be Dr. Eugenio, Professor Eugenio MENEGON. I never had the opportunity to meet him. This is the first time I will meet him online. He is Associate Professor of History at Boston University in the US. He was Research Fellow in Chinese Studies at the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, together with Professor Nicholas Standaert, and also at Duding, also quite a famous researcher, has retired now. Professor Eugenio is the author of two books and many other publications. One about Giulio Aleni, a famous Jesuit missionary in China, and then also about the book about ancestors, virgins, and friars, Christianity as a local religion in late imperial China, which is really a very interesting book, which gives us a lot of insights about the church life in China. So his current book project is an examination of the daily life and political networking of European residents at the Qing court in Beijing during the 17th and 18th centuries. And we really are looking forward to read this publication. So their topics is, first I will give the floor to Professor von COLLANI. She will talk about the famous Tournon legation to Beijing and the question of a general superior in Peking. And then later on, when she finishes, we will have a very intriguing title, Moribund Waiting for Medicine from Rome, documents in the historical archives of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples as a reflection of propaganda's missionary organization in China from 1622 to 1830. So may I now first, so each of you has 30 minutes, and I will, at the end, I will give you a reminder that your time is almost up. So I'm very glad and honored to firstly present Claudia von COLLANI. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for the kind introduction, and hello to everybody who joined us now. And I will give you a few glimpses into the transition between propaganda, between Federado and propaganda Fide in the Far East, which was, as everybody knows, not easy. My main subject, however, is Charles Thomas Maillard de Tournon, the first apostolic delegate to China in early modern times. And my main source is Kilian Stumpf's Acta Pekinensia, and this is here the first volume of the series, and hopefully we will at the end have 4 volumes, but this will take time. China was always the utopia and the great aim of all missionary orders in the Far East. Jesuits who were sent from Portugal, mendicants coming from the Philippines sent by Spain, and then later the missionaries sent by Propaganda Fide. And everybody thought that China was the most important country to be evangelized. And but this brought problems, of course, because several nations were involved and several people, as you know, are complicated. Propaganda Fide tried to erect new bishoprics in the Far East by way of the apostolic vicars. And this took a lot of time because of the far distances between Europe and the Far East. And we have the first apostolic vicars from the Missions étrangères de Paris, but some of them never reached their destination. And as everybody knows, the Jesuit mission was based on the principle of accommodation. And this was also used by Propaganda Fide, in principle, was not as far going as the Jesuits. And after several complications, the first Vicar Apostolic, François Palu, reached China in 1684. And this was the beginning when several missionaries, orders and congregations had to work together. A short time afterwards, the French Jesuits arrived, sent by Louis XIV, and the first Franciscans of the Reformed Franciscans were sent by Propaganda Fide to China. And so they had all together worked for one goal. The problem with Palu is that he was not an easy man, and he was influenced by Domingo Fernandez Navarrete against the Jesuits and against their way of mission policies in China. And this became a big problem. And he demanded from all missionaries an oath of obedience to the apostolic vicars, which however failed. The Spanish mendicants, of course, they struggled against it, and the Jesuits took it, but afterwards didn't want it. And Alvaro de Benavente, the Vicar Apostolic of Jiangxi, also sent by the Spanish mendicants and de la Chiesa to Rome, succeeded that the oath was abolished. Now we have one of the Franciscans, Bernardino de la Chiesa. He wasn't Vicar Apostolic for China, but when he arrived, the whole system was changed because the Portuguese Patroada wanted still to keep its influence, and they succeeded that 2 new bishoprics were erected for Portugal, namely Beijing and Nanjing. And to play a good game, they decided that the apostolic vicars should become the bishops of Beijing and Nanjing, and de la Chiesa became the bishop of Beijing, but only got to know after several years, and he was never really paid by Portugal. You see, Portugal was at the end of its possibilities. They had a huge sphere of influence over the whole of the Far East, and it was impossible to have enough people for mission, to have enough money, to have enough, and so on and so on. It was, they had to fight. But Propaganda Fide wanted to go in, and that caused problems between the two. And yes, unpleasant experiences with Portugal made De la Chiesa suspicious, and he proposed Propaganda Fide to send an apostolic delegate to China and to install a superior for all missionaries. And he complained that Portugal impeded everything, all new missionaries coming to China. And so again, he wanted to have a delegate from Rome. And on the other hand, we have the Chinese emperor, the Kangxi emperor, the second of the Qing dynasty. And he found on his southern tours that many new missionaries had entered China, but they had no fixed places, and it was not sure what they were doing there. And he became he became angry because he feared political activities, and some of his children, some of his sons also feared an invasion from Western people. So he instructed the Jesuits at court that he wanted to have control over the missionaries under a common superior. This superior should be under his permission and under his superiority. And he wanted the different missionaries to be of one soul and to live together and to have peace with one another. But it's, you know, how the situation was. It was never possible. Then he wanted to have a general catalogue of all missionaries in China, and Claudio Filippo Grimaldi promised to write such a list. Now we have a new situation. One of the missions at Rocher de Paris, Charles Migros, issued a decree in 1693 against too much accommodation in his eyes. He forbade the Chinese names for God Tian, Shangdi, and Tai Chi, and so on, and only permitted Tian Shu, Lord of Heaven, and forbade the participation of Chinese Christians at the rites for the ancestors and Confucius. And this mandate was brought to the Holy Office, and you know, it was confirmed, and everything was forbidden in 1704. And this decision should be published in China by the special legate, namely Charles Thomas Maillard de Tournon. And Tournon should also have some discussions with missionaries about the contents of the decree, but you know how it ended. Tournon was born into a noble family in Savoy, and he was elected as a young man for China without any experience in practical things, and he was a canonist, Utriusque Jure. And after a long journey, he landed in Macau in 1705. And now there was a question: should he come to court? Should he hide his task or not? Or it was a complicated situation for it. It was the first time that the young church in China was noticed by Rome, officially noticed. And besides the publication of the prohibitions, Tournon should make investigations about missionaries' opinions concerning the rites. He should try to find a dependence of the Propaganda Fide on the Pope in Beijing as a kind of papal nunciature, and he should collect and unite all missionaries together under common superior. Okay, but this delegation was on a bad star and not good prepared. Tournon was too young, too self-confident, only used to the Roman Curia and not to real life, hoping for a future career. And he was already ill when he left Europe. And he had also no idea about the situation at the court and how China worked. He didn't have any idea about the language, about the customs, and so on and so on. So you see, all missionaries had to be prepared before they came to China, but not Tourneau. And as Eugenio MENEGON also mentioned, there was the differences between China and Europe concerning such delegations. And Tourneau should have should contact perhaps the court when he arrived in China, and he knew the family of Grimaldi, but he didn't, and he was suspicious against the Jesuits. At first, he decided not to go to the court and to hide his business, but then it changed, and he wanted to be invited to the court. And the Jesuit functionaries tried to help him. That was Grimaldi, director of the Ministry of Astronomy, Thomas Prera as a vice provincial, and Antoine Thomas, and Jean-François Charbillot, French superior. And they made a petition to the emperor. The chief vessel of the Supreme Pontiff, superior general of all the missionaries in China, named Duolo, is coming to respectful offer gifts to your majesty. Now his arrival in Canton has been announced by Grimaldi. The emperor refused several times to receive Tourneau. He feared complications. And only after a petition made by Grimaldi on his knees, he agreed and invited him. And this legation caused problems because of the Chinese way to deal with other peoples. You know, the tribute system in China, when the vassals of China had to come in and to offer their gifts, and they received other gifts, and it was an exchange of gifts, but China was a master in culture and so on. And Europe had a quite other system, you know, in early modern times, there were already diplomatic exchange of diplomats between the different courts, and the Holy See was involved in these diplomatic exchanges. Tourneau, however, received a special treatment from the emperor because he was a religious man, and so he should come in dressed in the clothing of this country of ours, since he comes to conduct the business of his religion and has not been sent here to bring tribute from the kings of the Western Sea. Tourneau started his voyage in September and finally reached Beijing at the beginning of December after 3 months, and stayed there until the end of August 1706. And the ceremonies of his reception followed the official guest ritual of the Qing dynasty, but with some modifications for religious dignitary and because Tourneau was ill. He had 2 audiences on December 31st, 1705, and on June 29th, 1706, and then a farewell audience. And he was received with greatest honors and a modified guest ritual because he was also ill. And the intermediaries between him and the emperor was the court Manchu mandarins, who had to carry the exchange letters and so on. De la Chiesa, the bishop, was not in Beijing, as we know. On the other hand, was informed by the Jesuits about the imperial plans to have a general superior. And he thought that Tourneau should become the first superior, the general superior of all missionaries in China, which would then meet with the imperial plans. But he feared that the emperor would prefer the Portuguese Jesuit Thomas Prera as a superior. And actually, Tourneau planned to have a general superior to open an easy way for all missionaries from Propaganda Fide to come to China. Perhaps he wanted himself to become this superior, perhaps one of his entourage. In his eyes, many things were not good in the China mission, and he wanted to make order and so on. And but we know that he was not very successful. Primarily, he wanted to publish the decree of 1704 confirming the prohibition of the rights. In Macro's Mandat. yes, and de la Chiesa in the meantime had got the idea how the things went wrong, and he wanted to advise Tourneau, but Tourneau resisted everything. He was a chef, he was a superior. And he not only neglected the Jesuits and their expertise, but he demanded they had to acknowledge his superiority by giving him the kiss of his ring and by genuflection. And they did, but it was, of course, noticed by the Chinese, and Kangxi was not amused that something in his empire received such honors. Yes, at the first glance, it seems that the Kangxi Emperor and the Propaganda Fide had the same wish for a superior, but one has to notice that they had different expectations. And Tourneau at first did not tell the emperor what were his plans, especially not about the rights prohibition. And he wanted to speak secretly to His Majesty. Then he had to write a report about his coming. The chief point was his apostolic delegation, and he wanted an investigation of all missionaries if they were involved in public affairs or trade, and so on. And the emperor said, yes, they are under my eyes. What do you think? Is it okay if I have a testimony? Yes, it was. Then he spoke about General Superior, but Tourneau, but the emperor was not convinced about the reasons of his coming. And Tourneau, for a long time, did not want to tell about it. In his letter about the reasons of his coming, Tourneau thanked the emperor in the name of the Pope. Since I have a duty of obedience to your imperial orders, I add that such is the solicitude of His Holiness for the health of His Majesty. That's an official point, that he is desirous to have correspondence with his court and have someone who will continuously report on the prosperous state of the royal person and let him know anything in which he can be of assistance or which does not meet with your Majesty's approval. And they want to have a person of prudence, integrity, and learning, and so on, superior for all Europeans in China and for the best of His Majesty. Interesting in this context is the word correspondence. Evidently, Tourneau had a kind of modern, formal diplomatic relations between the Holy See and China in mind. And as I've already told you, in China, such relations were unknown. There might only the tribute-bearing nations come into China. And Tourneau was convinced until his end that Kangxi wanted such an exchange of diplomats, but he erred. Before the first audience, the Kangxi Emperor, before granting anything to Tourneau, sent a mandarin to him and asked him, would the Lord Patriarch be able to appoint such a superior on his own authority, or would he need to write to the sovereign pontiff? Was it not possible for the office to be entrusted to one of the Beijing missionaries? Besides those personal gifts required in such a superior, would it be better that he should be a man well versed in the language and the customs of the empire and possessing at least a 10-year knowledge of the ways of the court? And it seemed to be necessary. If, for example, the Mandarin would go to Europe, he would be not very useful because he couldn't speak the language and he had no idea for Europe. And Tourneau now has the impression that the emperor had changed his decision in favor of a superior, and he was suspicious the Jesuits were the one behind. And he told Henkama, but the Mandarins became furious. Is our great Lord to be judged by you as so feeble-minded that he listens to whisperers and only after wavering makes his decisions? They would want. In managing public and private negotiations, he always himself to be led by reasons only, not by human authority. You are guilty of an absolutely intolerable insult of our great monarch. So Tourneau had no real idea about the Chinese emperor and about China, and he just thought he was a big person, an important person of coming from Rome. And now for the audiences. The first audience was, as I've already told, at the end of December, and Tourneau received a special treatment. He was carried into the palace, which was normally impossible, and the place was an imperial orchard garden in the southwestern part of the palace, in a pavilion called Xinjiang Golden Mountain. And Tourneau followed first at the European rules of diplomacy, and he was very polite and so on. And now the emperor asked him, "Don't hesitate to speak out. Come now, speak freely, hold nothing back." Tourneau answered with polite sentences that he wanted to express the gratitude of the Pope, to start communications between His Holiness and His Majesty, because all European rulers had such relations. In Tourneau's mind, this agent for the future communication should have the confidence of the Pope and an exact knowledge of the European courts, and especially of the Roman Curia, and that this kind of commerce was highly valued by European kings. But the emperor, of course, was not interested in European courts. But then he asked for the men of confidence. In China, we have not such a distinction in choosing people. Some are near to my throne, some are midway, some are in greater distance. Would anyone, whosoever he be, to whom I entrust some business, be wanting in his due fidelity? Who among you will dare to deceive the pontiff? Religion forbids you to tell lies. However, whoever lies offends God. And the patriarch was evasive. The Jesuits here are good people, but ignorant of the papal court. The legates of princes regularly converge in Rome, together with those who are deeply involved in so many affairs. Here too, these are to be referred to others. And the emperor said, if the sovereign pontiff should send a man of approved morals and intellectual gifts, not inferior to the Europeans here, who does not interfere in others' affairs and does not want to dominate others, I shall treat him with the same kindness as the others. And but it would be difficult for such a man, he continued, for the Jesuits were 40 years, many years in China, and had experience in the court, but what should a man from Europe do? And he also advised Tourneau, the Chinese have no matters in common with Europe. I only tolerate you because of your religion. You should have no concerns beyond your souls and your doctrine. Even if you come here from different empires, you all have nevertheless the same religion, and therefore each European staying here is capable of writing and receiving letters from the Pope, as you have been talking about. And so he said, since the days of Limado, Matthiorici, to the present, we have Europeans at this court, and we have never had any reason to blame them. I want this my testimony to be made known in Europe. And this was the end of the audience, and the Crown Prince tried to explain it to the Jesuits, that it was a dangerous job to be the superior of all Europeans if something would happen, and then the guilt would be laid on this superior. And so it's for the good of your religion alone that the emperor does not wish to concede this to Dumolo. Then Tourneau wanted to purchase a residence in the palace quarter of Beijing. The Chinese were well informed about the controversies among the different missionaries in China, and Kilian Stumpf, the author of the Acta Pekinense, explained the situation to Tourneau, mentioning Kangxi's Sasan tour of 1703. When the emperor returned from one of these tours to the southern regions, he warned the Jesuits, and especially Grimaldi, that he had seen great differences in the modus agendi of the missionaries, which could have results. And these Europeans who were wandering around did not fit in the Chinese customs, and they were to be considered in slight esteem. And therefore, the emperor wanted the number of many smaller churches to be reduced to a few larger ones to have better control. And the missionaries of the different orders and nations should be located at the same place. No new churches were to be established unless permission to be requested and personally granted by himself. And also the Bishop of Beijing was informed about these matters. And so the Jesuits visitor Grimaldi promised to guarantee for everything. Tourneau still believed that the Kangxi emperor desired to have a superior in the way he knew. Stumpf instructed him that Kangxi wanted a superior chosen and known by himself and tested over many years. But Tourneau still was convinced that he could be the future superior. With one word brought by me from the Supreme Pontiff, I would have rendered myself better known than would have another by services lasting many years. This seems the case from the fact that on hearing of my arrival, the emperor admitted me immediately into this court. Stumpf told him that this proved nothing. As regards your relationship with the emperor, Your Excellency came as a private person. Your claim to be the superior of all the missionaries and apostolic visitor is an internal church matter and does not concern the emperor. And Tourneau was still more and more convinced that the Jesuits could influence the emperor and had spoken against his plans of having a superior and of buying a house in Beijing. You alone have the ear of the emperor, therefore he heard it from you. And Stumpf denied this. And the emperor was also disappointed that the Europeans in the south had no ideas about arts, mathematics, and sciences, whereas Jesus told him that these men were well instructed in European way, perhaps in philosophy and theology. And when the emperor wanted to go to the north, to Tartary, Tourneau wanted to have another audience with him, and he wanted to entrust him secret things. And says,
Claudia, you still have 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. I will try to get to finish my paper. Yes.
Okay.
And okay, then Tourneau gave a secret rescript to the emperor, and he wrote him that Portugal wasn't. It was not trustful because Portugal hindered all missionaries to enter China, and the propaganda Fide missionaries could never come to China, and he tried to make a gap between the Portuguese and the French Jesuits, and yes, and that Kangxi should not rely on the Jesuits and on Portugal, but of course on himself and so on. But the prince and the emperor were not convinced, of course. And the emperor warned Tourneau that the missionaries should also be concerned about the religion, not mix into internal things of China. And when he got to know that the rites were prohibited, he became, of course, furious, and he demanded a piao, a kind of permit for missionary work, and all other missionaries had to leave China. And I think that Tourneau and also Migron later were not convinced that it was possible to prohibit that Confucian rites for the Christian, and that this would offend the emperor. And I've really no idea how Tourneau was convinced that it was possible to do so. And the emperor again and again warned the missionaries and Tourneau that Christianity had to be, I forgot, had to accept Confucianism and not to fight it, and it was not possible to prohibit Confucianism, and that people who disregarded Confucianism had to leave China. And during his whole life, the Kangxi Emperor had Jesuits at his court as teachers, but also as artists and scientists. Some of them were closer to him and served him as a kind of friends with whom he talked comparatively free. The church in China was for the first time in early modern times officially noticed by the legation of Tourneau, but Tourneau was young and unexperienced and ill and suspicious and led by stupid, unworthy men of his entourage. And he committed many faults in China, also to other missionaries, not only Jesuits. And he did not explain the most important reason of his coming to confirm Charles Mégreau's mandate of 1739. And it was clear that the emperor would never tolerate such an assertion as Confucianism and Christianity are not compatible. He could not tolerate the fact that Charles Mégreau, with his adherents, had a kind of small state within China. And so this was a bad start with the relations between the Holy See and China. And because this delegation was not successful, but on the contrary, it was anti-successful. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Claudia. I know it's time limit is sometimes very cruel because your information is really very rich. And for the participants, I mean, they always can consult your books and also your publications. And once again, thank you so much for your contribution. Now, I want to give the floor to Professor Eugenio. I know you also in this field has a very rich experience. And you will present, as I understood, a very good presentation of your topic. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. So yeah. I will now share my screen and show a PowerPoint. And let me know if you can see the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Full screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you, first of all, to the organizers at the Center for Catholic Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and also the sponsor, the Istituto Ricci of Macau, for inviting me. I have been working on Propaganda Fide for a few years now, spending a lot of time at the archives. And so I can bring today here my own experience of using the archives, which are the best gate to study the operations of propaganda in the world, of course, but particularly for the people who are here today in China and East Asia. First, a word on my title. A moribund waiting for a medicine from Rome is part of a sentence that I will explain very soon from Matteo Ripa, the founder of the Chinese College in Naples, today the Oriental University of Naples. And I will be talking about documents today. And I hope I will make you realize how documents, letters, this kind of communication was really the blood that kept this operation going. Without all this information flowing between Rome and China, China and Rome and other parts of the world, really nothing could have been accomplished. So we should not discount the importance of the archives, the importance of paper and ink in all these operations. I will talk about the documents in the historical archives of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples in Rome, really as a reflection of the missionary organization of propaganda in China between the beginning of propaganda up to the eve of the Opium Wars. Actually, after that, after the 1840s, things will change quite a bit. And my own expertise is in this period. I want, first of all, start with the sentence from Matteo Ripa in a report, in a letter that he wrote to the Secretary of Propaganda in Rome from Beijing in 1717. These are his words at the end of his letter. To wait for an answer from Rome, and he's talking about all kinds of pastoral, ritual problems, practical problems, is like the case of a moribund waiting for a medicine. We send letters, very few responses come back from Rome, and in the meantime, the patient, that is the mission, dies. So I think that Claudia has already shown the great difficulties under which propaganda and the first official representative, we could say, of propaganda to China was Legate Charles de Tournon, operated, sandwiched between the different powers of Europe, Portuguese Padroado, the French, and propaganda from the very beginning was a rather weak operation with few men from different congregations and religious orders. It had to rely on transportation and support from powers other than the papacy. And so really it was quite difficult for Rome, which also had a very centralizing tendency to control things from afar, as Claudia again has shown in the case of Tournon, to control this far-fledged operation. The other religious orders, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and so on, had semi-autonomous missionary provinces in Asia that could make a lot of local decisions. This was something that propaganda tried to do through the institution of a procurator in the Canton Delta area, but that was never in the DNA of the congregation, that wanted always to control from Rome what was going on in East Asia. My presentation today is extracted from an introductory essay that I have written for this forthcoming publication by Ad Dudink, that has been mentioned by Professor Taverne, a catalog of Chinese documents in the Propaganda Fide historical archives between 1622 and 1830, that he has compiled after spending a lot of time in the archives. These are only the documents in Chinese language. Therefore, they do not represent all the China holding of Propaganda Fide, which are enormous. This is just a fraction, and it has been, in a way, an easier operation to extract and catalog the Chinese documentation. Edited by Zhao Huntao and Emanuele Raini at the Urbaniana, published by Urbaniana University Press this year. It should come out in the fall. And here you also see the catalog, the 2022 catalog, where you can see more information on this book. And in this introductory essay, which is quite long, I sent it to Father Taverne. I hope you didn't get bored. It's 70 pages.
No, very interesting.
I tried to explain both the structure of the archives and how to use them, and how they reflect actually what was going on both in Rome, in the bureaucracy of the Congregation of Propaganda Fide in Rome, and what was going on in China itself, and among the different vicars apostolic, the procurator in different parts of China, religious orders that were affiliated with propaganda, and so on. Professor von COLLANI has already given you a sense of what was going on at the time of Tournon's arrival in China, which would say is the beginning of the propaganda operations really in China. Of course, before then there had been Palu, there had been other people connected with propaganda. As you can see in this chronology, and I will not repeat things that many of you already know, we see that in 1705, Legate Tournon, on his way to Beijing, establishes the office of the Procurator of Propaganda in Guangzhou. And later on, this post will move to Macau, back to Guangzhou, and eventually in 1842, it will move to Hong Kong. By 1711, immediately after the death of Tournon and his ill-fated legation in Beijing, it's the beginning of the papal Propaganda Fide mission in Beijing itself, with 3 missionaries, among whom was also Matteo Ripa, which will last exactly 1 century. And this is during the late Kansi period, a period that is already a period, I would say, of controversy and decline for the mission after the Tournon legation. Catholicism is eventually forbidden during the reign of Yunzheng and becomes illegal in the provinces, although underground operations continue, but is allowed in Beijing and initially also in Guangzhou. Here we see Carlo Tommaso Thomas Maillard de Tournon, and I really see the establishment of the procuration office in Canton in 1705, even more than the arrival of Palu in 1684 in Fujian, as the true beginning of the real operations of propaganda in China. Eventually, the missionaries are also expelled from Guangzhou, and the only place where they are allowed to operate freely, it's Beijing, in fact, whereas in the provinces, they go underground. There are still missionary procurators who are economic representatives for several of the religious orders, including propaganda in Guangzhou, working there. Eventually, the Jesuit order in China is dissolved, and propaganda will try to take over as much as possible of the properties and the operations of the Jesuits in China, though this will be also quite complicated. By 1811, exactly 1 century, propaganda will have to abandon Beijing. The last 4 missionaries of propaganda will leave, but propaganda missionaries also of other orders will continue to be present in the provinces. As you can see, and this is because of my own research on the Europeans in Beijing, I focused in this chronology, especially on Beijing and Guangzhou, Macau, as the places where Christianity, especially after 1724, continued to interact with the political power of China, and in a way allowed a lifeline for the mission to survive. Without these letters, without the silver that was being sent from Europe, without the men who could travel on different ships of different East India companies, Portuguese ships, Spanish ships, and so on, who would go through Macau and especially through Guangzhou, it would have not possible to sustain the operations of the missions and also Propaganda Fide. And to give you a tangible sense of how things were working, here, for example, we see Beijing, the place where the missions were still working, even during the period of prohibition. And in red, you see the Xitang, the Western Church, which was the small Propaganda Fide church in Beijing, which was one of the 4 churches of Beijing. I call them the 3+1 church because the other 3 were all Jesuit churches. The Peitang, the Northern Church by the Jesuits, sent by Louis XIV, and then the Tuntang and the Nantang of the Portuguese Padroado Jesuit mission. Here you see the sketch of the facade of the Propaganda Fide Western Church in its restoration from 1753. So you have also a physical sense of what this looked like at the time. And here you see the convent of the Dominicans, and the picture at the right is how it looks today, where the procurator of Propaganda Fide in Macau for many, many years resided. against the official will of the Portuguese government, but in a sort of compromise. He could not own his own operation and house, but he could be hosted by the Dominicans in their convent. Of course, for the period that I'm dealing with, the kind of organization of China in the hands of Propaganda Fide, which has been in part described by Claudia, was in apostolic vicariates. Here we see a map from the following period, the 1850s, that gives you a little bit of a sense how Rome and Propaganda had really mapped all of China in these gigantic areas. Sometimes in some of these areas, there was maybe 1 or 2 missionaries. So you can imagine that this is more of an ideal representation of what these apostolic vicariates in China looked. During the late 19th century and into the 20th century, things would change. There would be more missionaries, there would be more conversion. And here we see, for example, an early 20th century map. I think this is from the 1930s or 40s, where you see the territories subject to Propaganda Fide around the world, and you can see also China on the right side. Now, let's go a little bit into the archives in the second part of my presentation. And here I start by showing a document. This is an appendix to a very important document that the Procurator of Propaganda Fide established in Canton and then Macau and then later in Hong Kong would produce every year in 2 copies to be sent to Rome with all the happenings of the propaganda missions in East Asia, but most of the information was on China, and all kinds of extracts from letters by the missionaries in the in the Chinese Empire that were received by the Procurator. In December of 1728, the Procurator of Propaganda Fide, Domenico Perroni, in Canton, we can imagine him, was sitting at his table, very busily trying to finish in his neat handwriting this report in 2 copies. So you can imagine how tedious this was, because these reports were up to 100 folios long. To be sent to Rome with the next ships. And of course, this we imagine that in the past they didn't worry too much about time, but that is not the case. The monsoon season was very specific, and these documents had to be prepared in December in order to be sent out. And so you can imagine him, and he wrote this in his own correspondence, working very hard. He says, "I must wake up very early in the morning, and often I have to go to bed without dinner after working at the light of a lamp for many hours." So here we imagine him doing this. But in this case, in this special document called a ristretto, or we could call it a synopsis, he did something unusual. Instead of, and this is a sort of appendix to the usual memorie that he was sending, these are extracts from the Beijing Gazette, the Imperial Gazette published in Beijing in the year 1728, with all kinds of information about official activities of the emperor, special events at the court. And so we can see that what the Procurator was doing here is also sending some sort of curious information, but also of intelligence about the politics of China. And in one of the pages of this ristretto, we also see that he had one of his Chinese secretaries copy some of these official documents during the Yongzheng period. So this is just to give you a glimpse of the kind of documentation, both in Western languages and in Chinese, that you can find at the archives, but also to make you understand how it was part of a very set bureaucratic process, where you have a sort of bottleneck in the Guangzhou area, the procurator, that is collecting all this information in his hands and forwarding it to Rome. Obviously, individual vicars and missionaries could also directly write to Rome, and they did, especially when they didn't like the procurator, and they had to say something that they didn't want the procurator to read. But a lot of the information was processed by this important official, who became a sort of linchpin. You could even almost call it a nuncio, unofficially, more of a practical one. He didn't have, of course, a diplomatic position, but really a very powerful position that determined a lot of the workings of propaganda in East Asia. Now, I wanted to give you a sense of how propaganda worked and how the working of propaganda is still today reflected in the archives, so that when you go visit for your own research there, you need to spend some time, and there are excellent guides for this, to really understand how the collections are put together, because they actually still today reflect the workings of the congregation. So, of course, the nominal head of all congregation was the Pope, as head of the spiritual and secular government of the Holy See. But each congregation, and propaganda was the last one to be established in 1622, had a cardinal prefect, who was the head of it. There was also a congregation of cardinals. For propaganda, it was a minimum of 12, the number of the apostles, but sometimes more, who collaborated together with the cardinal prefect in making decisions. And most important, there was a secretary who really was extremely important in running smoothly the operations of this empire of paper. It was all done through meetings in Rome, through writing of reports, letters, orders, and so on. You see the palace of Propaganda Fide near Piazza di Spagna that still exists, partly built by Borromini, a beautiful palace. And that's where, after 1657, when it was built and finished, these operations would work. This is a mixed charge, a hybrid charge, where you have both the organization and the functions of propaganda. So I mixed them a little bit. So you see that under the secretary, there was an administrative staff. You had administrative officers called minutanti in Italian. You had scribes who would copy documents, scrittori. And then very early on, they established an archivist. So you can see how important the archive was from the very beginning of the operations of the congregation, as soon as it was organized by its first famous secretary, Ingoli. They had a specialized archivist. How did the operations work? It worked through meetings. There were general meetings that happened relatively rarely, once or twice a year usually. Then there were weekly meetings where the ordinary business was discussed. And then there was also, and this is more interesting for us, a series of special commissions, but one special commission on the East Indies and China that lasted for a long time, and that also contained a lot of materials discussed on special Chinese and East Asian problems. So let's talk about these meetings, because they are actually what forms the archival series of the archives. And when you go there, you have to request these archival series. First, we have the general meetings, the Congregazioni Generali, where the main official business of the congregation and the official decisions were taken. And there was the commission of the cardinals, invited consultants, theologians from different religious orders, for example, to solve particular problems. And this formed the official core of the congregation. These were monthly, but sometimes they didn't happen as often, and were coordinated by the secretary and his staff, and were presided by the cardinal prefect. And here you see how this worked and what kind of documentary series today exist that represent the work of these congregations, of this congregazione generale, these general meetings. First, there were the official acts that were written in Latin, the Acta Sacrae Congregationis, the proceedings of the sacred congregation, where the secretaries would write down, in short, the proceeding, what they were doing. It's like the minutes, and also the decision that were taken. And if you go to the archives, you should start with the indexes of the acta in order to find out. And this is all manuscript. Nothing is being typed by modern archivists yet in the old series, where you can find a rough index of the topics. But where did the decisions come from in this general meeting? Well, there were selected letters, reports, and so on, sent, many from the missions or produced in Rome, that are the original papers referred to at the general meetings. So there are, as you can see, over 1,000 volumes of this. And they really reflect the major problems and the major decisions taken at these important general meetings. So they are simply a selection. They cover the entire world, and within them you find also materials related to China and East Asia. There are two series, as you can see. Then there were the weekly meetings that in a way were necessary to prepare for these monthly or periodic meetings. Most of the routine work was done in those smaller weekly meetings where you had only the cardinal prefect and the secretary with their secretarial staff, in particular these administrative officers, that would help them sift through the material coming to Rome from all over the world, drafting correspondence, documents, and so on. And after there was consultation in these meetings, the prefect would make decisions, or very often defer decisions, say, okay, we don't make any decision on this. You have to imagine that correspondence was very slow, and so it was not possible to do it all the time. And many routine matters were decided at this time. And the scritture riferite nei congressi, the documents referred to in the weekly meetings, is what you have to look for, the original document from the missions on this. And in the words of the former archivist of propaganda, Joseph Metzler, this is the most precious collection from a historical point of view on the history of the global missions, because they reflect in a certain way the daily life of the missions. And so really, if you're interested in pastoral work and daily life in the missions, this is where to go as well. And there are rich materials on the mission. There are two series on India Orientale e Cina, East Indies and China, Cina e Regni Adiacenti, China and the adjacent kingdoms, and also many miscellanea with treatises, catechisms, dictionaries, memoirs, and many Chinese documents. And here we see the Pope visiting Father Metzler when he was an archivist in the 1980s and being shown the documents when the archives were still in the Palace of Propaganda at Piazza di Spagna. Here you see how the archives look today and some of the scritture riferite nei congressi, for example. And so they are in this bound vellum, large volumes. They are all original documents. At Propaganda, you are always and only shown original documents, which of course is wonderful for us researchers, but it presents a lot of problems of conservation. Now I want to talk quickly, and I know that I have another 5 minutes maybe, right, Father Taverne?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the weekly meeting, and so I just talked about this series, and you can see how they were produced and that they reflected these congresses, these weekly meetings. Then we have the Special Commission on the East Indies and China, which I would say for us in Chinese and East Asian studies is probably one of the most, one of the richest repositories. And this was a permanent commission that lasted from 1664 to 1856. It's full of letters coming from the missions themselves and from a lot of missionaries. And this is extremely detailed and micro-historical materials on many, many topics. And here I draw a list of these possible topics that you can read on your own, but as you can see, it goes from the papal legation to policy papers to the reports by the procurators, letters by the missionaries, as well as the vicars apostolic all over China, Chinese language materials, and also blueprints of residences, drawings of buildings like the one I showed before, and so on. And in this special commission, which also very often had consultants, they also had some official proceedings in Latin. They became also, I think, in Italian at a certain point. And then you had the original documents. And so first you should go to the indexes again of the ACTA to know the proceedings, and then you can refer to the original papers discussed in each meeting. And they are organized in the volumes, not by the date when they were written, but by the date when they were received in Rome. Finally, there are the archives of the procurators, which are not well known also because they're very frail and they have not been open to the public for very long, and only parts of them are still open because they need restoration. There is a wonderful essay in German by Joseph Metzler that gives a very good inventory of these archives and what they are in German. And they were brought from Hong Kong after by Celso Costantini in the 30s or 40s, I don't remember, after the abolishment of the position of the Propaganda Fide procurator in 1923. And here you see all the name of the procurators from 1705 to 1923, and going from Macau to Canton to Macau and then to Hong Kong. And here you see the kind of documents you can find in these archives, including a lot of administrative documents. Here, for example, we see the register of the letters of one of the procurators in the 18th century. You see that the same man was writing letters in Portuguese, in Italian. If you move a few pages, you will find French, you will find Latin, you will find Spanish. So all the Romance languages. And so these men had to be really polyglots, and they were writing not only to the church and to the missionaries, but also to a lot of business people, because they had to help the economics of the mission. And here, for example, we see in the book, famous book by Paul van Dyck on the Canton trade, an image of a receipt for 2,000 Mexican pesos that he received, that Palladini, the same procurator, received from a Macau Armenian merchant. If you want to have more information, please go to the site of the Propaganda Fide Historical Archives, where actually a lot of this information is nicely presented both in Italian and in English. There you see the address. It is on the campus of the Urbaniana University near the Vatican. It's a small archive in terms of the seating, especially during COVID, so you need to reserve, but the personnel is very accommodating, and I've always had a great experience there. And going back to some recent publications, we have the catalog that is coming out to celebrate also the 400 years of the congregation, but also just came out this entire very detailed catalog of the Chinese books and documents and manuscripts of the Tournon legation in the Biblioteca Casamatense. And of course, even if they are in another library, they really are part of the history of propaganda. And this is in 2 volumes. It has taken Isabella Ceccopieri, the librarian there, who is now retired, 20 years of work, but finally it's out. And I would say that these are publications that we should keep in mind that just came out this year, and a good celebration of 400 years of propaganda in the world and in China. And now I do a little plug for my own work, which is the China Historical Christian Database, which also includes the propaganda mission. And so I invite you all to come and visit both our website and especially use our database. It's not complete, it will take years to finish, but we have already included all the Jesuits, for example. We have included most of the Protestant missionaries. We have included some Catholic congregation, Orthodox missionaries, and in the future we will have all the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and so on. For example, the Pime Fathers are all included. Soon we will have the SVD and so on. And finally, my conclusions, sorry. So the activities then of propaganda in China are best understood from two vantage points. On the one hand, we have to consider the point of view of the Roman bureaucracy with its own administrative, political, and theological dynamics and its centralist tendencies. And so that's how the archives are organized. On the other hand, we are confronted by the reality of the local social and religious life of the Chinese Christian community, the pastoral, the liturgical, the disciplinary concern of the missionaries in China, in East Asia, and in other parts of the world, and the logistical and the economic challenges of the entire missionary operation across the sea, inside China, and so on. And so always keep in mind these two things when using the archives. And I would say that these documents really open a window on the daily life of the Chinese Christian community and their pastors, and the reaction of Chinese society to Catholic activities. Of course, you can also study how the hierarchy in Rome, of course, made the decisions. And by concentrating, for example, in my research, but also others are doing it, on this Chinese picture of the communities, I think we can go to a corrective. We can have a corrective to a Rome-centered vision of the mission. And also, in a way, it will be a consolation for those missionaries who, like Ripa, felt that the mission was moribund and needed medicine from Rome and didn't receive it. And often they felt ignored. So by giving them back this historical agency, I think we are also doing a service, not just to history, but I would say to their own labors over the centuries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Eugenio, for your not only interesting presentation, but very clear presentation. I must confess to you, I read the whole introduction to the book, the forthcoming book, and I was not bored at all. I was fascinated by the contents, and I read it from the beginning to the end. So thank you so much. And also both of you, Claudia and Eugenia, for your great contribution to this conference. Of course, it's about, as Eugenio told us, it's about paper and ink. But through that paper and ink, we really get into touch what Cardinal Tagle was reminding of us, that the whole, the central piece of the whole propaganda of the faith is the person of Jesus Christ. And I think going through these archives, we really get a sense not only of today and the future, but also of the past, what all these missionaries have gone through. And I want to share here a small anecdote. Many years when I started my research, I went to the archives of Propaganda Fide, and they were still in the Palazzo, as you mentioned there. And the one who I met was Josef Metzler, as you know, a German. And he told me something very important. When you go to the archives, he said, you need one important thing, that's patience. And you have to adapt to the Roman bureaucracy and the Roman culture. From what I heard from you, I think things seemingly have improved, especially the personnel there are accommodating. But I think many words, especially people from here, from China, and also the former archivist here, Father, he mentioned that sometimes for us it's very difficult to go from here to Rome, and first of all to have the necessary time to go to the archives and to find the necessary information. But the information is very important for any subject concerning to mission. So I agree fully with this. So now we still have a few minutes for questions and clarifications. So anybody who wants to raise a question, please feel free to do so. Claudia, perhaps the panelists or Eugenio, do you have any comments?
No.
No.
I guess I made the same experience to have patience. I once wanted to have the manuscript of Longobardo from the archives of Propaganda Fide, and this took much time. And Father Müller, also German from the Steiler missionaries, told me, yes, in Rome we count not in years, but in thousands of years, or hundreds of years. You need patience.
Yes.
But it's I found it very useful, or Eugenio's paper, and so I'm looking forward for the books about the contents of these archives.
Yes.
Castanatense and Propaganda Fide.
Yes, and here we have to thank especially Fide, who retired, and then Isabella, for the fantastic work they have been doing all these years. I mean, many people have been asking, when is the catalog coming out? And then finally, this is the parousia, the day that really these things, and also mapping China's Christian past, Eugenio, is really a wonderful work that you are doing. Since I'm teaching the topic, it will also be a wonderful tool for the students to use. So thank you, both of you, for this contribution. Any other questions?
I see there is a question from Anthony Lam.
Yes, Anthony.
You have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Thanks to the two speakers. Wonderful presentation. And I have a small question to Professor Eugenio. And you mentioned that in 1812, the last ex-Jesuit passed away in Beijing, Peking at that time. And what do you refer to the term ex? You mean because the Society of Jesus dissolved in 1775, or they quit the peaceful? Which one?
No, it's because the Jesuit order did not exist any longer in China. It had been dissolved.
You cannot call them Jesuit anymore.
No, so some of them actually joined the propaganda mission.
Oh, okay.
So they were no longer Jesuits. So we call them, for a lack of a better term,
but is these two personality contradict with one another? That means if I am Dominican, for example, I join the Propaganda Fides, and then I will lose my status of Dominican. Will not.
No, actually, there were Dominicans and Franciscans within the propaganda mission. They remained part of their orders. They followed the routine of their orders and so on. But they were also called apostolic missionaries of Propaganda Fide. It was a sort of hybrid organization dictated by practicality, because in those cases, sometimes, in the case of the Dominicans, the King of Spain also gave money to them.
So you mean just because they don't have the status of as a Jesuit, but do they count themselves a Jesuit? At that time, for example, Castiglione, they live as a Jesuit,
so
their own life,
I mean, in their heart, I think most of them, the case of Amiot is very famous, considered themselves still Jesuits. But from a canonical point of view, the society did not exist any longer. So they were priests at that point. They were too old to leave China, or they would not be given permission by the emperor to leave China sometimes. And so for that reason, they simply said, I will die here. and they had enough properties to survive, and
Yeah.
they continued some of their pastoral work, but many of them were just quite elderly, so they didn't.
Yeah.
They just were sort of in last phase of their life.
Okay. Thank you for very clear elaboration.
Okay, I have here a question from the archivist from Macau, Benedict Keith. I think Eugenio, probably you can answer this. He asked, I would like to know more about any structure identified especially from Macau diocese, or we need to identify the font parchment by the Portuguese padroado. I'm not sure whether you catch the question, Eugenio.
Yeah. Most of the materials regarding Macau as a padroado diocese in the archives will be found in those series that discuss controversies or jurisdictional problems between propaganda and the Portuguese government. And there is plenty of those. So you will find some materials in those series, but there is not a special series, as far as I know, for the earlier period on Macau as a diocese. I am not an expert on the period of the 19th and 20th century. I suspect that things change at that point when the padroado fundamentally will, at a certain point, will finish, and then there must be materials on Macau diocese for the later period, but I would have to look it up. I'm not 100% sure. The big change in the organization of the archives happens in 1892, when they change from the old organization, according to these meetings, as I showed you, to a modern protocol number system. So every document receives a protocol number. Now they're still divided in series, which reflect the meetings, but now they are also identifiable by protocol number. And so there is a different organization there. But there is material where you can find descriptions. And actually the archival personnel in the last 20 years, under the leadership of the previous archivist, Don Cunha, have spent a lot of time doing typescript, computerized inventories, document by document. And so when they were opening the new series, they were also putting them in order. The difference between the old archives and the new archives is that the old archives are all bound, which of course makes it more difficult to steal documents or to confuse documents. Whereas the new archives are in folders. Very often they are simply pages of reports, and this is complicated because it could mean that people sometimes take documents or that they put them in the wrong order. And so that is why I think it was important to have such a detailed inventory done. This does not exist for the old documents.
Okay, thank you. Here is another question from Oscar Ngai. May I ask a precision? Where will be the major part of Franciscan archive related to the mission in China after their division? I mean, will it mainly be in Assisi or mainly in the archive of Propaganda Fide? Question mark.
Maybe I'll let Claudia take over.
Yes, Claudia.
As far as I know, it's in Rome, in the archives of the order. And it's not in Propaganda Fide and not in Assisi, of course, but the main quarter of the Franciscans in Rome.
Okay, that makes it clear.
So there is actually, this is the curia of the general.
But it's hard to come there, very complicated.
You have to set up. You have to set an appointment, and it's
before, and then you need to OFN connect mail. Give me your email address and this Quan Yao Oscar, so then I can ask you better. It's not via
Okay.
internet.
Also careful, because there are, of course, also the archives of the different branches of the Franciscans. So, yeah, so there are the Capuchins, for example, have their own archives. I mean, the Capuchins are not really a member of the family, so it depends on who you're talking. But the Curia Generale is in Santa Maria Mediatrice, near the Vatican, not far from the Vatican.
There's an Institute for Franciscan Research here in Germany, so you should consult them. That would help.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps this is a more difficult question to answer here. A question to Professor Eugenio MENEGON. Could you please spend some more words on the hierarchical decision documents of the Propaganda Fide? Thank you.
So in my own research, I have tried to keep away from those as much as possible, because they have been the focus of a lot of research in the past. People were interested in what are the decisions taken in Rome regarding the rights, regarding this problem, that problem. Of course, there are letters of instruction that were sent by Propaganda Fide, signed by the Cardinal Prefect and by the Secretary to the missionaries. There were all kinds of decrees that were issued, and this actually also contributed over time, together with decision taken at the Holy Office, to produce a sort of missionary canon law. There are a couple of wonderful volumes, one published in the 1890s, another in the early 20th century, with all the missionary decision taken by Propaganda Fide on issues regarding matrimony, confession, all kinds of pastoral issues. But if you actually look, they refer always to some case that provoked that decision. And so if you go back into the archives, you can also find the original document where that decision originated. Did it come from Peru? Did it come from China? And some scholars have written also a dissertation. There is a dissertation from the Urbaniana from the 1950s that really looks at all the canon law cases coming from China. And that's very interesting, because immediately you see the connection between the field and what is happening in Rome. So I would like to say to Ray Zhang that, in fact, there is a new movement now among scholars to try to reverse the perspective and to try to see that, in fact, many of the central Roman decisions were, in fact, provoked by the local. So what was happening in the periphery would provoke a reaction in Rome. The papacy, the papal bureaucracy reacted, was not propositive. I mean, except, you know, when they had the council, maybe at the beginning, they made a lot of decisions in principle, things should be like this, we want to implement them. But then the implementation starts, and then all the problems come back to Rome. And so now there is a group of scholars in Germany, for example, that have started a project at the University of Frankfurt called Plural Christianities, and they are very interested in this. They are looking at the archives of the Dattaria Apostolica and looking at all the cases of privileges and legal cases. And this shows really that it is in the diocese of Europe, it is in the diocese and vicariate apostolics outside of Europe that the problems sometimes emerge, are brought to Rome, and then are discussed by consultors, by cardinals, by the Pope, and made into rules that then go back again.
Okay, thank you so much. Anselm, I think time is up now.
Yes.
So here, just in a few words, again, thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you so much, Eugenio, for what you have presented today. It's really very insightful and very interesting. And also, thank you for your passion and dedication to the topic. And so I hope in the future, don't retire that early like that. Go on, and I'm sure you will be of a great help to all of us. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank
everybody.
you. Thank you to presenters, you know, Professor von COLLANI and Professor Eugenio MENEGON. And also thank you, our moderator, you know, Father Patrick. And so today's program ends here, and we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. The theme of tomorrow is communication. As mentioned by Cardinal Tagle, is a very interesting and challenging topic we have to face, today. So see you tomorrow. Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you to
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
to everyone.
Yeah,
Thank
see
you, Johnny.
tomorrow.
Bye.
Well,
Bye-bye.
bye.